All right, great. So my name is Stephen Phillips. I'm the director of the Cal Poly LA Metro program in architecture and urban design. This is a special last event of our lecture series for the year, and will actually be hopefully our last online webinar. We've been at this since April of last year, and we're super excited to end with a finale. So thank you, Stephen and Nat, for being with us. For those of you who don't know who we are an off-campus program for Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and we are in Los Angeles, where our students have been, well, they're not all here this year, they're all over. And we have been virtually working in our studio. We've been in Los Angeles, of course, for over 10 to 11 years now. And we're intern our students in offices. We have studio architecture history and practice, and we have a wonderful group of, I think, 8 or 9 faculty now. So it's really a wonderful, wonderful program. And we are super excited that we have opportunities to invite and have great speakers with us. You know, Nat and Stephen are people I've run into in my journey along this architectural space. And they are super, super nice people. I always like to support and have anything to do with super nice people. And I didn't know enough about FAT until actually I knew about them, but it's been a long time. And then I was at Mabel Wilson's Princeton event, which is very strange that you can go into like a Princeton video chamber and be part of something that you're not anymore. And she just reminded me how important you guys were in the time and today. And I just wanted to bring that back. I'm just going to introduce them very quickly, and then we'll have a great chance to see the work that they did back in the 2000s, launching their careers, and your careers have evolved ever since to very significant positions, which I think is also interesting for us to talk about how one starts and then moves their practice forward in terms of their even presence in the world. So concurrent to his practice and born out of a desire to challenge prevailing architectural orthodoxy, Stephen Slaughter and Nathaniel Belcher co-founded FAT, a 4-person multidisciplinary design collaborative that pursued work that questioned the role of race and identity in architecture and is shown in venues throughout the world, including the Studio Museum in Harlem, the National Gallery of Victoria Architecture Center in New York, and the Fons Regional d'Art Contemporaires, Young Architects exhibition in New Orleans. Nathaniel Quincy Belcher is head of the school and professor of architecture for the School of Design and Built Environment at Curtin University, appointed in 2020, fairly recently. He is recipient of grants from the National Endowment of the Arts, the Graham Foundation, and other notable foundations and research entities. Educated at Virginia Tech and Harvard University, Mr. Belcher, called him Nat, holds both bachelor's and master's degrees in architecture. He served 2 terms on the advisory board for the Graduate School of Design at Harvard and was on national boards for the American Institute of Architects, National Council of Architecture Registration Board, and the executive board for the Association of Collegiate School of Architecture, where he served as treasurer. His work has been exhibited and published in many publications, including Sites of Memory from Princeton Architectural Press, Harlem Worlds, Metropolis, as a metaphor exhibition publication through the Studio Museum in New York City, and the Archelab exhibition in Orleans, France, sorry. After receiving a Master's of Architecture from the Ohio State University, initiating his career in Talmain's studio Morphosis, Stephen Slaughter has worked in close collaboration with a number of highly respected and influential artists and architects, including our West Jones partners, architecture, Gary Bates, and Gros Bonsmo of the Space Group, and artists Edgar Arsenault and Tanya Aguinaga. while in Los Angeles, which is probably where I met you in LA,
Yeah.
with the Watts House Project. As a 20-year practicing professional, Slaughter's experience spans from presiding over the rollout of retail boutiques, residence and restaurants, to managing large-scale institutional projects for the past 15 years, along with practicing and producing work for exhibitions. Slaughter has taught in a variety of academic institutions such as SCI-Arc and Woodbury University in Los Angeles, and the University of Cincinnati, and the University of Kentucky, while living in Ohio. Inclusive of the many boards, committees, and nonprofit arts organizations he has chaired, Slaughter additionally served as designer, project manager, and inaugural board member for the Watts House Project, a nonprofit art-based neighborhood redevelopment organization that leveraged arts programming and architectural rehabilitation for the purpose of creative placemaking. So enough for me and all to them. Thank you two for being here, and we're really looking forward to seeing your work and then having a conversation.
Thank you. Where's Nat?
Thank you. So,
Okay.
thank you. Thank you. So, yeah, I'd like to start by offering respect and acknowledgement to the Whadjuk-Noongar people, past, present, and as the traditional custodians of the unceded land on which I regularly work, travel, and live. So is everybody is everybody seeing the image and hearing me? I can't see anybody, so.
Yes.
Good. Okay, so this is a conversation, maybe an ongoing conversation of some thoughts that I've had and Stephen and I have been engaged with. And the first part of the project will be for me to kind of contextualize what I'm calling critical making practices, and then to say a little bit about Harlem Ghetto Fabulous, and then Steve is going to follow up about his take on the same set of events, Harlem Ghetto Fabulous as a thing. And
Nat,
then
are you sharing your screen? I'm sorry. Are you sharing your screen? Can anyone see a slide?
No,
No,
sir.
You're not sharing your screen yet.
I have to actually share the screen. Share. There we go.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm the old guy. Okay. There we go. Can you see it now?
Yes.
There we go. Sorry about that. So, just to critical making practices. And so in terms of the conversation piece that we've had, this has really been a sort of telling project for us. But I did want to start a little bit about this idea of ritualizing or talking about the acknowledgement to country, which is a practice that I had known existed and probably seen most familiar in my experience in the United States and Canada, which is in some ways a sort of gentle way of engaging in the reconciliation process. And it's really a part of a broad internal practice within Australia. And I think to some degree, this begins to imply a real way of starting the reconciliation process. As we understand what we do as designers and makers and builders, we are in many ways part of a cultural tradition of geography and colonialism that is in question. So for me, the critical making practice as a narrative was a subtext in the back of the way I think about and understand my role, or roles of introspection and novelty that emerged over the last, I would say, 100, 200 years as a late variation of the sort of modernist or the modern project of understanding the globe as a whole and what that means for the built environment. So I would say that within the context of critical making practices, because of the dynamic way in which cultural criticism, in many ways, the application of theory in a discipline like architecture, there are a certain amount of unintended consequences that change the nature of what might be understood as a fairly normative or objective discipline like architecture, or you could say any of the design disciplines themselves. it implies a certain amount of transactional, or what might be called a neoliberalism, a certain amount of capital or a certain amount of market-driven or forces that really are a subtext and drive the way in which we build and interact with the built environment. And to some degree, the canon and the core of these practices are always challenged by the forces of the larger society as a whole. There are all sorts of results to that. One is a certain amount of fast casualness about architecture, where the formal anxieties that are understood as being completely objective begin to be deployed in ways that undermine the larger formal agenda. So it's easy to understand development and the deployment of capital and the project of the quantification and the measuring of the world in order to sort of replicate or control it as a geography, as a neoliberal project, for example, or a neo-colonial project. When you think about the casualness of these things relating to development of architecture. I also think this exists in the current anxieties or the fashions of architecture to some degree. The idea that these are objective and mute or non-consequential actions to the larger cultural impact of the world, or are they simply another form of fast casual architecture, and the anxieties that they represent are simply about the movement of capital? Are they purely market driven, or is there a cultural context? So in many ways, the understanding of the disciplines and the authorities can be canceled by a generation later, and those that have bought themselves find themselves exposed that they have been sitting at the knees of some pretty questionable practices, and what that means for the ways in which they assert objective understandings of architectural practices and the histories and the canon that they assert to be part of is continually questioned in different ways of practicing. So I think critical making practices begins to look at the unintended consequences of those questions, the authority of institutions, and the ways in which we might re-engage and work differently. One of the things that's really important for me is that the experience or the identity of generation of folks that understand this canon are now part of the conversation, and in many ways overtake the conversation of making or remaking the world that we live in. It might be as simple as understanding something like the use of energy in the early 20th century in our built environment was one where we assumed a certain amount of limitedness of the fossil economy. And we began to really understand that there is a limit to that. And the consequences of that mean that we have to remake our world around a decarbonization project, or that we understand the movement of capital around a colonial infrastructure and a power structure that 120 years ago was seen to be untouchable. Now it's collapsed, and you're seeing a decolonialization project. And a similar thing happening around the reconciliation of the First Nations conversation. So in the space that we occupy as practitioners, as makers, I think there is a certain amount of space of segregation and a space of desire, and that interaction begins to ask questions about the tools that we operate within and the foundations that we assume to be stable or important. So in other ways, we might call this a certain amount of intersectionality, where different forms of practice begin to challenge what might be considered orthodoxy or clarity. So in the early 20th century, an understanding of modern architecture asserted an objectivity or an internationalism that runs full frontal and faced by a cultural production that challenges it back and forth. And you begin to see that there's no stability on either quarter, and that's an interesting place to be in. So I feel as though just by my presence or just the interaction of a conversation or the ability to be in platforms as faculty members or as leaders of culture of institutions, you begin to force change in ways that might not be managed or understood by the history or the legacies of or the theories that are that were the foundations of my understanding of making a place. So I do think there's a language of externalities that begin to hijack, trigger, or overtake the practices that we assume to be stable and correct. And that begins to create all sorts of unintended consequences or all sorts of surprises. One example that I might that might seem common and very accessible in the world in which we regularly work is the notion of Jane Jacobs as a figure that is really deploying or empowering the public through her journalism or through her community action, and that creates a certain amount of defense of the city. It is a really narrow perception of what the city should be, and it's maybe not as objective as we might want, but it begins to empower communities where the challenges of the 1960s might create a community praxis, which in turn leads to a certain amount of NIMBYism, where the communities that are then empowered by the practices set up quite innocently in the late 60s, early 70s, begin to assert a certain amount of authority in the public sphere. And you see this sort of transfer of wealth where the sort of ideas of the community that are popularly projected by capital, whether suburban, exurban anxieties or the idea of the neoliberal project, begin to create a certain amount of challenge to what might be called what's best for society, or what is the understanding of the foundation by which we might work. So I think critical making practices are all the sorts of things that challenge and create diversity and a certain amount of messiness in the way in which we work and build our world. So I did talk about a generational time. At any one moment, you can see these as trending, popular words, but they also talk about some rather real long transitions, whether it's the decarbonization or the understanding of what carbon and fossil fuels mean, or decolonialization, understanding what the geography of the colonial project means for us moving forward, or understanding the notion of reconciling the First Nations conversation around the globe, which has all sorts of rather dynamic implementation problems as we look at architectural applications in very specific places. So I think critical making practices are a quite fascinating way to look at the world that I'm existing in, not necessarily in to undermine what might be but the desires of spatial form that I'm fascinated by, but also seeking solutions. But simultaneously, there's a certain amount of redress which might be thought of as seeking a certain amount of salutation or recognition, almost like the way in which the acknowledgement is an affirmation of the anxieties of place and placemaking and the sort of transitions of time, and honoring that as a ritual to see how we think and work. I also think that in this space, especially over the last 150 years in the US, there's an intellectual tradition of collective action or cooperative, I would say, community, where the African American community, as an example, and this happens in many aspects of society, or the communities of folks that see themselves engaged in an intersectional project, worked first as a cooperative to assert and in some ways to co-opt, to work within, other ways to challenge the dominant narrative around any particular world. So these collective practices have an impact on different disciplines and emerged sometimes within the canon of institutions and practices, sometimes as a side practice. So one example might be the sort of history of Blackness in architecture, understanding the word Black as anxiety of the American tradition, not to exclude the broader understanding of the term, but what it means for architecture might also be laid simultaneous to the enormous impact of the built environment on the American project over the past 150 years, and what that means as it's deployed throughout the world. And so there are platforms and contexts that can drive and change what might be called the theoretical legacies associated with it. So one example was a project that I was involved in, and you could fit this action in 1996 against the Black studio at Yale University in the 80s with people like Richard Dozier, or similar works of folks that were coming into might be the mainline cultural institutions and generating or having a sort of conversation of what it means to be part of that world. And in this conference, a generation of artists, architects, theoreticians, including Thelma Golden, Mabel Wilson, who become really, really current parts of the conversations, came together and created or answered a charge that I did, or I organized with some colleagues both at Ohio State and more broadly. This was an endowment from the arts funded project when Mark Robbins was there, and you begin to see this sort of cycle of how does that begin to create discourse. So I was asking, what architectural discourse is heavily influenced by Western formal philosophy, and that ideas in modern architectural discourse that have been traditionally presented as neutral or universal are now routinely exposed as marginalizing and patriarchal. So that was the sort of subtext, the way I was trying to just sort of say, okay, let's acknowledge the way I've been trained, and let me see a way that I can begin to create a different way of operating within that. So that's just to kind of set up the context that we worked within as we created the Harlem Ghetto Fabulous. And this project, and I'm gonna, this was a later project after that conference when Stephen and I were in conference and brought together by Thelma Golden as a curator. And it was really in a very bold way to look at another way or a similar way of looking at this problem. The Charles Whitney Museum of African American History in Detroit is a building which introduces a very specific way of resolving the need of the transformation of power, authority, capital, and to find yourself in the built environment. So this is a building that is part of the cultural infrastructure in Detroit, and it is given a rather straightforward relationship of what might be called the iconography of identity and place. And so that's maybe one strategy, but I do think that the way in which I was educated, and Stephen was maybe trying to think of a way where you might quantify that more through experience or more as an anthropologist or someone that studied material culture rather than someone that was looking for a symbol or a caricature. So we began by looking at Harlem as a place and trying to understand its fabric and all its messiness and all of its sort of capital, the way in which buildings were built, the way in which the fabric was created, the way in which the formal anxieties of both security or the movement of capital throughout time, the inheritance of this place began to create maybe something that's a little bit more organic, that's a little bit less clarified by a simple reading of a sign that says we are this particular place. How do you signify this through this set of experiences? And so we were reading this culture for the way in which it acted as a mechanism, how it was socialized, the way in which public spaces were interacted, and in some ways it was really the way in which Black bodies were part of this. So FAT was in some ways a collective that was formed to engage in this, and it was really thought of in some ways like a boy band, and that it was a sort of artificial implementation of both an assumption, and you might think of it as an opportunistic project, but also it was a sincere way of addressing some of the sort of broader conversations about itself. This is where the charge, and now Thelma Golden was part of that initial conversation in 1996. At the time, she and has been the longstanding curator at the Studio Museum in New York, and in many ways one of the most influential art critics and curators in the currency of contemporary art practices. And this is probably most celebrated in the show that she did at the Whitney in 1994 called Black Male, where she was using the black male figure both as caricature, subtext, and subject to talk about the objectification and the representation of that figure, but also around masculinity objectively, and also around contemporary American art, not specifically African American art. And she created a practice and really propelled a generation of artists that had an enormous impact on international and national practices of contemporary art. And she charged a bunch of architectural practitioners to come and look at Harlem, almost in a way, the same way she had looked at the black male figure. And Stephen and I worked together on a proposal that was accepted to participate in that. And part of the research, as I said, was going back and looking at Harlem itself, but also looking at the history, mainly the mid-20th century history. And here was Mayor Lindsay in the 1960s had a kind of design competition. It certainly didn't seem to be done with close consultation of the community at the time about the redevelopment anxiety. So the sort of idea of the redevelopment in the United States was that you would create the interstate highway system, you created an enormous amount of open spaces, and you put an enormous amount of capital into raising large parts of the city to reform and remake them. And so part of this process late in the day, many of these communities sat undeveloped after the redevelopment process started. There were 4 teams that were part together: Princeton, MIT, Cornell, and Columbia. These were all private institutions. That Cornell does have a public relationship, but they really are not necessarily about the same context. And this is a sort of world before Jane Jacobs. And to some degree, we were responding and reacting to this rather than a sort of formal process where there was an enormous amount of power asserted. We were looking for a way to deal with how one might adorn these buildings with a different way of understanding its place. So we were looking at the fabric and the way in which the community, the African American community, was adorning both the body through hair, through teeth, through a certain amount of bling, as the term might be, and how that might begin to assert itself in the built environment. And so this collage in the frontispiece and these sort of sketches that we were sort of trading back and forth were different ways of saying how this might identify locations and how you might adorn the city with a presence and a different way of thinking about the public realm, and to tactically assert the sort of broad forces of cultural production into what was deemed the ghetto fabulous as a sort of fictional space. So we were looking for these interventions as a direct opposition to the 1967 exposition that was looking for the city to be replanned by a series of designers who would go on to be some of the most prominent designers of their generation: Richard Meyer, Peter Eisenman, Michael Graves. These were all leaders in those teams that were looking at Harlem. And so this was a kind of a meme or a reaction we saw as a way of looking opposite to that. So our response was to create a kind of replication of this environment in the museum itself by creating a kind of a real blinged out interior space, almost like an exclusive space within a bar and a club that was adorning the city with a certain amount of glamour, whether it was there or not, for the sake of asserting that relationship. The space itself had an attempt to begin to see what that might look at, and this was iterated through different replications of it. There was a video, what you're not seeing here. There was furniture. It was kind of adorned as a kind of a figure or an interactive space that probably the best illustration of this side was the series of renderings, many of which were done by Stephen, where we were trying to give images that were a real expression of the Harlem, the ghetto fabulous, with a kind of fictive character called G Money, who lived this kind of over-the-top glamorous life, kind of like the gold adornment of teeth, and the sort of illustration of the body, the female body, the Black female body, in a way that is both criticized and criticizing of that objectification, but also this kind of over-the-top glamorization of images of pools and shiny surfaces. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve to talk a little bit more about his thoughts about this this conversation we were having, and step away, and then be back a little later.
Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Good. All right. So our prompt, I guess what I'll do is actually talk about our collaboration, our conversation that has kind of gone over the things that's influenced both of us, both of our careers, both as practitioners and educators. And I wanted to elaborate on Harlem the Ghetto Fabulous as a departure for how I started to think about these issues. To reiterate, our prompt was to imagine an architectural response to the forces of gentrification that threatened to transform the community and potentially whitewash both the history and significance of Harlem. Our challenge was to give agency to its legacy while negotiating both the need to resist commenting on the economic eventuality of a more diverse Harlem while simultaneously embracing its future. Nat talked about our collaboration, and so I don't want to go into any more than just include our collaborators. Los Angeles' own Adam Wheeler and David Messon is our four-person group. Nat, of course, on the right and me on the left, looking quite dapper in my 90s attire. Our solution centered around the idea that status, historic, economic, cultural, etc., should somehow be evident in the work, and that Harlem's two competing populations, culturally produced and disseminated aesthetics, should be hybridized to illustrate the hypocrisy in the way gentrification was being covered in the media. And so we were honored to have the likes of the late Herbert Michamp write about the work. In fact, fabulousness, ostensibly a more egalitarian form of identity than luxury, is the explicit theme of one project. Harlem, the Ghetto Fabulous by Nathaniel Belcher and Stephen Slaughter tries to humanize the modern buildings of the 20th century urban renewal without erasing their history. And I think kind of completely missed the point. We were inspired or more to the point, antagonized by images in the media that consistently depicted the disparity between the historic Black community of Harlem and those who would inadvertently act to oppose them. The installation then portrayed an alternative reality void of the perceived economic disparity that existed between the two populations. We then used satire to exaggerate the narrow, superficial, and stereotypical aspects of each group's cultural symbols of success, to envision a world where media outlets like The Source and Wallpaper folded in on one another. We represented this world through the framework of a mock magazine spread, and I think Nat showed some of the images. This is one that described an opulent society of hip hop high design. It was as well a critique of the materialism, misogyny, and hypocrisy that ran and still runs rampant in both cultures. So my first opportunity to explore design for and about the African-American community was more of a rebuke and critique of that cultural production than a celebration. And from that point forward, The choices I've made, the chances I've been given in my career has allowed me to learn, explore, and portray the central question Harlem World asked or posed to both Nat and myself. What is the story of the ghetto? Why is the ghetto fabulous? And how does art emerge from this space? And most importantly, can architecture address any of these questions? This is actually the formal beginning of my talk. It's a switch in terms of, instead of critical making practice, I'm thinking making and critical practice. Because a lot of the things, given my experiences in the academy, once moving to Cincinnati, kind of was led by issues of making actual tangible materials, and what are the ideas behind their fabrication and existence. And so mentioning Cincinnati, I'll cover this quickly. This is Kenyon Bar, historic African-American neighborhood, completely obliterated or destroyed by urban renewal, the Highway Act of, I think, 56 or 58, and zoning. And these are the territories that when I started teaching, left Los Angeles and started teaching in Cincinnati, that influenced me and sort of colored was a prism by which I started looking at these central themes of making in and for these disenfranchised communities, its lost histories, its recovered identities, and its promising futures where I exist as a practitioner, academic, and educator today. So in pursuing work that addresses the underserved, it's past the slew of racist housing tactics that catastrophically devastated the physical and social fabric of the Black community, cannot and should not be ignored. In fact, work in the sphere should, given its history, should be understood for what it is: an active resistance, political in charge. It is by default an action and reaction to the numerous failed strategies of urban renewal that you see in Cincinnati, and other things that we looked at in the projects of MIT, the Harlem projects of MIT, Cornell, Columbia, and the like, and urban redevelopment, as well as the de facto and de jure policies of underinvestment and mass incarceration, and the demographic and market pressures that are transforming, I think I may have, the demographic and market pressures that are transforming the current state and status of communities of color today. And to be clear, the benefit of working in this sphere is not just philanthropic. Like all creative communities, like the Shakers, the indigenous or aboriginal cultures of this land, and influences to me, especially living in Los Angeles, like Latin and Asian culture and craft, there's much to learn from the traditions, arts, and attitudes of the Black community. Again, as mentioned, epitomized by the creative and intellectual outpouring of the Harlem Renaissance, and demonstrable in the birth of blues, bebop, funk, and hip hop. This space, this community, our people remains an under-investigated, sometimes misunderstood, and under research source of intellectual and creative production. Thus, work focused in and centered on quote unquote disadvantaged communities should express and manifest the physical, cultural, and aesthetic sensibility of its people. And so I'll begin by sort of starting with how I sort of entered the work. I was lucky to have Nat as a professor. He was my first African-American professor in architecture. It was simultaneously to me joining Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity at a fraternity that was founded at Cornell in 1906, who famously had a tradition of working in the community, working for the community. Martin Luther King is one of the famous members of Alpha Phi Alpha. And through this organization and the many after-school programs that I engaged in as a young college student, these are the, at Ohio State, I left Ohio State, went to Hampton University. These are the Brothers of Gamma Iota, chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha at Hampton. I continued the work in the academic sphere at The Ohio State University. And so this is the neighborhood. At the time when I was a part of it, it was called the Neighborhood Design Assistance Center, or the Neighborhood Design Center, founded in 1983 as a partnership between the City of Columbus and Ohio State University. The Neighborhood Design Center provides planning and design services to Central Ohio neighborhoods and communities that are historically underserved and underinvested. And this work again followed me when I came and started practicing in Los Angeles professionally, and soon after graduating. I sought opportunities to provide design service to the underserved communities through organizations like OBD, Organization of Black Designers, and WHP, the Watts House Project. And let me concentrate on this a little because it is in Los Angeles, or was in Los Angeles. The Watts House Project was an art-based neighborhood redevelopment organization that leverages arts programming and architectural rehabilitation for the purposes of creative placemaking. The organization paired teams comprised of an artist and an architect with families from the neighborhood to work collaboratively to transform their home into a monument, if you will, that speaks to the individuality and vitality of the family and the culture and character of the community. It was work that transitioned easily to the academy through an ethos that maintained that design and architecture were service professions first. And through design, people can be moved, touched, educated, and elevated to engage and become agents for their own community. Now, I'll go through the next series of things really quickly so we can, because I'd like to engage in conversation. No more was this clear than when I started teaching full-time and had the opportunity to work with University of Cincinnati School of Architecture and Interior Design's Community Outreach and Design Build Initiative Metro Lab. Metro Lab paired students and faculty with local community advocates, developers, and not-for-profits, and their stakeholders to discover, ideate, and fabricate work that supports the amelioration of the built environment through the design, build, rapid prototyping process. Partnering with organizations, community groups, the studio takes on real-world projects and asks students to work collaboratively to assess need and offer design students solutions in response with a focus on three core principles: learning through making, applied research and innovation, and community engagement. So the project that I'd like to begin with, or the project the inaugural project that I started to work through the organization was for Finley Market, which is a market in Cincinnati I'll speak more on, and Youth Hope Inc., who had a Bag Kids program. So to describe Finley Market is Ohio's oldest surviving municipal market house that was established in Cincinnati in 1852. Operated by the not-for-profit Corporation for Finley Market, the market continues to strive to be a vibrant and thriving public destination in the city. It's one of the only farmers markets we have. Partner to Finley Market is Youth Hope Cincinnati, a not-for-profit that provides economically challenged boys and girls ranging in age from 8 to 18 with social, educational, and recreational activities that enhance personal talents, teach life skills, and this I got from their webpage, bonds the kids to the absolute importance of making positive life choices. Metro Lab's collaboration with the two organizations was to aid in the resurrection of a program where adolescent boys and girls from over the Rhine sold shopping bags to patrons in and around Finley Market. The program's comeback was due to the desire to engage the youth of the community, and the community right now is being gentrified. And so the patrons of the market are the African-American and newly, I guess, yuppies that are moving into the neighborhood along with people from the burbs. And the idea was to have these young kids have the opportunity to sharpen their entrepreneurial skills and serve as ambassadors for the cultures they represent. The task of the studio was to create a neutral space made formal by its association to the market where the two populations can connect around the exchange of goods and services. So consistent with my teaching was the implementation of digital design and fabrication to ideate, pitch, prototype, and produce quickly structures that traditionally would have taken an entire term to resolve. And so we started by researching, looking at contemporary aesthetics in the food service industry, as well as display technique and kitchen aesthetics, and small kiosk and small shelter design for inspiration. And we synthesized this into a proposal that we pitched to Findlay Market and Youth Hope Inc. Of a kind of rolling mobile transaction counter that was versatile, functional, again, mobile. And it included a scenario or situation or an idea how it can be stored. Then after receiving approval, we worked on producing a prototype that we took to the market. Riveting video. And that's the director of operations of the brain. Dang, damn. It was a problem. It was because of how we built it. The weight was too high, and so it became a tipping hazard. We adjusted. We redesigned, moved the wheels, and then began kind of fabrication, working with the kids of the market, of the neighborhood, working with the students, and having a series of days where we went out to the market and installed. And so for us, the success of the project was the success of the program. And for 4 years now, actually, since the kiosks were built, on most sunny weekends, kids from the neighborhood, you can see kids from the neighborhood sharpening their entrepreneurial skills by selling bags at the market. And we were really proud at how successful it was. They kind of pocket the cash, and the people get to meet the kids from the neighborhood, and the kids from the neighborhood get to meet the people that are coming, and it becomes a kind of exchange of cultures, which I think is really successful. The last project I'd like to show also engages in the process of design, build, making, and community engagement. And it also allowed me to reconnect why I pursued architects in the first place, and also allowed me to think through the issues that I had that was problematic, or questions I had from Harlem the Ghetto Fabulous. It was this process intrinsic to working in and with the community that gave me the opportunity to redress some of the issues I had with that work, and not for its own sake. So my question was how I could leverage the culture I was engaging to develop a method of working technique in the exploration of a possible aesthetic that wasn't decoration due to cultural appropriation. And so with that question in mind, the opportunity for pursuing technique and aesthetics came with Metro Lab's collaboration with a Cincinnati 501c3 called Elements. And that's Cincinnati's own Talib Kweli, Black Star, Mos Def, anyone? Okay. Elements Urban Arts Center is a local not-for-profit arts organization whose core mission is to serve as a catalyst for change for Cincinnati's inner city youth, founded and supported by a diverse array of community leaders and stakeholders who believe in the power of music, poetry, and art to change lives. Elements teaches, champions, and represents hip-hop culture in Cincinnati. The idea of the collaboration between Metro Lab and Elements was to use the process of design to foster a relationship that will allow each student group to learn and appreciate the training and talents of the other, and so doing, hopefully form a bond that can forge community and sponsor change. And so part of that challenge was the two cohorts. One, middle-class, affluent, all of European descent, whose taste ran between classic rock and country, that's just Ohio, and the other predominantly working class, historically underserved and underrepresented group of preteens and young adults, who I think this became an opportunity, were as familiar with Cool Herc as my UC students. So I thought to use the music as an ambassador, as a way of bridging the divide between the two cohorts, because they both had gaps in where hip hop came from. Hip hop born out of the Sedgwick Towers in the Bronx, born out of as Nat had mentioned Jane Jacobs, a kind of feud with Robert Moses in New York, and the racial spatial practices that gave rise to ghetto. It was important for the students to understand this history and share this history with one another, and that become a touch point for conversation and collaboration. And so the first, and we did a video, and I'll skip that video, but the students did a video, shared that video, which was a history of hip hop, and I had an assignment, or I had an idea that the students then could collaborate to produce a kind of diagram of the video as a way of starting or sponsoring the collaboration. And for reasons that became clear to me later in the semester, this was a complete failure. I had assumed that the Element students who signed up to participate would be there every day. They weren't. Be interested in doing homework that my students weren't even interested in doing, let alone teaching, and they weren't. And so we had to adjust the tactics to get the kids involved. So we divided the semester into two sections, production and construction. And so the first part, we hosted event days that the students could or could not participate, but they ended up doing a paper day where we plastered the whole space with paper, and graffiti day where where the students were invited to tag the space as a way of letting them know that that they own the space, and that their visions and ideas now were written quite literally in the space. And as we started to begin conversing about how to change it, their voice was part of that conversation. We had paint balloon day. This is very complicated. As a way of building trust between the two cohorts, and as a way of producing work that would both be inspirational and be appropriated and cycled into the things that we produce. So we simultaneously to these days would sort of talk to the students and talk to the administration, talk to the institution, and ask what they wanted and how much latitude and leeway we had to transform the space, and they gave us free rein. And so we pitched a series of projects. We went through a series of readings on the emerging topic of hip hop architecture, and we settled on sort of three precepts through that. Mix, the work should be a hybrid between two methods of fabrication, digital and hand. Sampling, the work should be made of modest when possible and recycled and reappropriated materials. And syncopation, there should be a formal or material consistency in the terms of the work's relationship to each other in the context, that context being its branding and the space itself. And so we settled on a material palette, and we began working. And so the rest of these are slides of both the prototypes that were done simultaneously, the things that we did by using digital fabrication to sort of like compress both prototyping and production and installation. It was touching because in some cases, this is the first time that a student had ever seen what they designed built and installed, and knowing that she had a role in it, and knowing what its impact in both the space and the organization would be. She was touched, and they would cry, and I would just ask them to keep working. And so these are some of the things that they produced. There was a desk that was out of order. It had plexiglass. We took the plexiglass. We sort of milled their logo and their precepts on it. Illuminated the desk. There was a series of things. There's a lot of work that the students did, and we did this over the course of 2 years. So it was consistent and sustained. We were embedded into the program, and the only thing that has deterred the work was the regime change at University of Cincinnati, and unfortunately, MetroLab is no more. So through the process of the studio, we were able to introduce, educate, excite the students of urban design of the Urban Design Center with the ideas that design as a career, with the goal being that Element students would be part of a pipeline we were putting in place. The collective student experience of making, breaking, and making again, the rapid prototyping process affords allowed the students to develop a vested interest in the success of the student well-being of those serves and the sustainability of the collaboration while working rigorously towards the successful completion of the project. So by demystifying the myth of the ghetto employed to propagate fear and exploiting the testimony of the ghetto to avail to provoke revolution, the project sought to augment the ghetto's perception and change the trajectory of both cohorts by simply introducing one to the other by art and design. And so it happened again, and we hope this happens in the future. But this is one way that that I took the ideas that I and Nat had been talking about, of the ideas that led to Harlem the Ghetto Fabulous, the issues that I had with it, and tried to translate it into working directly in the community and thinking about how the community itself, the site itself, the culture itself can be productive in the design of and making of things for the community. And with that, I will cede I will stop sharing my screen, escape. And Nat, if you can share yours. Stop.
You need to stop yours, I think, but let me see if I can.
I'm out.
Okay. Is that good? You see that?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think in closing, what we wanted, or we had talked about, and what I wanted to maybe bring up is, just like the cycles of the economy, peaks and troughs, there's a way in which the American urban project has been challenged by disturbances, and to some degree, I would protest and our reactions to events. So without going into all of them, you could look at the history of the United States and the provocative way in which urban centers have been a stage in which the racial or the cultural or even the economic anxieties of the society played out. So 1968, you have the death of Martin Luther King, and you begin to see cities erupt. And some examples, 1980, you have the tensions in the city with the rise of both the national, international community and the African-American frustrations. Similar thing happens in 1989 with the sort of the acquittal of several police officers. And then for many, probably the most storied in our generation is what happened in Los Angeles in 1992 as a response to the acquittal of the officers involved in the Rodney King engagement. So this way in which the city as the stage for, and in many ways, a different sort of counter texture for the place is an interesting subtext. And I think it really begins to talk to some degree about the messiness of the unintended consequences of the critical inflection between the control of the spatial conversation and the deployment of economy and the sort of organic reaction to it. A similar thing happens in 2020 with the murder of George Floyd. And there's a broader conversation in the community. And at some point, there are things which might be called by some riots, there are protests, but this begins to be a larger conversation of the American project as a whole. And it is a community not just in isolation, but it is a community as a whole. So the city of Philadelphia as a whole came out and wanted to signal a certain amount of concern about what had occurred. And this led to a conversation both around what Blackness was about, what that sort of racial context, what it meant about policing space, and this sort of evocation of, in this case, in Philadelphia, the early 20th century, the redevelopment of the city and the development of the museum district. It becomes the stage in which you see this action and reaction to the events that occurred last year. And in a similar way, this begins to be an inflection that takes the anxieties and the understanding of place, urbanness, and the protests as a tradition which goes throughout the world. So I was in Australia, Perth, Australia, and you see in a similar way, the largest public square becomes a way in which the society grapples with the same understanding of place, space, race, identity. This sort of intersectionality becomes a sort of powerful legacy, and in many ways, a different kind of byproduct and an assertion, I would say, of a challenge to the conventions of placemaking, and space. So I think this overlapping of or intersectionality or intersecting of anxieties on the built environment is in many ways a curious way to think about what architectural theory and practices will emerge in the near and current future. And I would just offer some examples, and these are really curated to be provocative in this particular context. One is Frederick Douglass, the 20th century former slave that becomes the most photographed, the 19th century former slave that becomes the most photographed individual of that century, an orator, and in many ways a very popular figure in the context of a world that's grappling with the legacy of race-based slavery. And both his challenge to the world, the economy in this country, but also in some ways, his belief in the American project for all of its principles. So he's in many ways asserting to Abraham Lincoln that the intentions of the framers of the Constitution of the United States are noble, and that the practice is to figure out how innately or how closely we can force that purity. It's not necessarily one of provocation for provocation's sake. It really is believing the principles, and he lived and in many ways succeeded within the transactional nature of the world that he was in at the time. And then another example might be the contemporary artist Adrian Piper, who on her 64th birthday, who had been known as an African-American artist, has said that, by the way, I am no longer going to be, I'm retiring from being being Black, and sort of says, I would rather be an Anglo-German and selling her new identity as an English and German ancestry, almost trying to take the notion of her ancestry and beginning to recreate. So she's known for giving cards which are sort of a provocation in like business card that really kind of challenge what you might perceive of her art or her way of working. And she plays this pretty straight in terms of her notion of race. And so this becomes an interesting way in which she thinks about both engagement with space, engagement with society, and a sort of understanding of the inability of institutional control or something that might be considered an orthodoxy to help us engage with the public space. Or Andre Lorde, the poet, who asserts her identity as a Black woman, as a lesbian, as someone, as a mother, as someone that really feels as though and challenges the notion of the tools of the master's house, and that to some degree she says that we have to recreate, we have to engage in making, and we have to engage in both acting and participating in ways that are unique and assert our particular agenda. And one might see her position as a more radical rethinking of the sort of comforts of the legacy of placemaking or space, or of interacting, or of creating in the world. And then I think there's a similar sort of thing in which the Black Lives Matter as a slogan, as a provocation, begins to be slipped into the neoliberal or the sort of transactional spaces of our culture, and almost as if it is a kind of brand that is both asserting a very real concern and the evolution or provocation, but also fitting quite neatly into the executions of the space in which we work within. And so an example that is you could say is a rather clear assertion in opposition to the museum in Detroit that was presented was, how do you begin to think of another transactional assertion of power, of place, of country, where the civic space, cultural space of the Smithsonian and an architect it creates a museum that attempts to do something that is a little less of a caricature or a different way of thinking about what it means to put a Black object in a space in the early part of the 20th century, 21st century, in the country known as the U.S. And David Adjaye saying that architecture has been consumed by the capitalist agendas and many ways presenting and acting within it is an interesting sort of thing to consider. I do think that, you know, Black Lives Matter Plaza branded almost in a way like we see that corporations are dropped in, this being a political evocation that is in many ways a provocation to the sitting president at the time, but also neatly placed within the street of the city is another way in which you begin to see both the transactional nature of the provocations that are brought out and the messiness that we're dealing with, and also new ways of thinking about placemaking. But I'll end by saying that the recent Black Reconstruction Collective show that was at MoMA, which is in many ways both an action or a response to the sort of legacy of the theoretical traditions of most of the participants, in that they were trained in the context of the legacy of someone like Philip Johnson, who is in fact, Philip Johnson. The exhibit is in the museum that bears part of his name. And during the show, I don't know if it's still up, but the time that the show just came down, but I don't know, they put a burlap sack over the name of the Philip Johnson Wing as a way of interacting or engaging with the questions that they're dealing with and the legacy of that. So I think it's an interesting way to think about it in the context of this show. And it's been an intriguing exercise for me to re-engage in this project and talk with Steve about what this means for today. I will say that I think that in the end, what's really nice to be part of or to see is that many of the individuals that were part of that earlier conversation, the Jazz Architectural Workshop, and the legacy of the institutions in many ways. Many of these people were educated at places like Cornell, Harvard, Princeton, et cetera. But also you begin to see the Black Reconstruction Collective, not just as a show, but as an organization that sets up a 501c3 and actually is looking for an executive director. So this is this idea of creating something that is much more of a conversation than the imposition of a particular idea or thing. And with that, I will stop. And Steve, I don't know if you have any closing comments. So thank you very much. And I guess we are happy to take questions.
Wow. That was extremely, I mean, this is the first time you gave this lecture, you two?
Yeah. I mean,
all right. I'm really excited that it was videotaped and it'll be out in the world forever. So well articulated. No, it's great. So well articulated, except probably my muddled intro. So well articulated and very kind of clear and powerful. Kind of an interesting legacy to even begin to discuss. It seems so synthetic the way you guys presented it. You know, this early, I mean, you use such great words to describe the way you use satire to try to almost really attack a media culture and the way in which things are presented into the world with humor and a very different kind of approach to then the second, which I think Stephen really articulated, a very, very present, everyday, real, and seemed very, when you've got the critical project on one hand and then you've got the active project on the other. So it's really an interesting thing to see that evolution, to question maybe, I know obviously it's different times, different places, different agendas, different issues, different concerns, always bring out a different approach to trying to have a voice and make a difference, which I think you guys are both clearly doing. So again, I'm applauding you and just grateful that you came to talk to all of us today and to inform us on things, that are very, very real, very, very present, and very, very historical for a very long time, seemingly too long, one would think. I kind of have to ask some questions if you're
I was
willing
just
to
going to
let
say,
me.
thanks for
That,
inviting us. It's been a good exercise for me, at least, to engage in that.
oh, I think this is so articulate. I hope you guys take it on the road and it goes to venues everywhere. So you keep the conversation rolling and pushing. And I actually like the way you're self-referential, you self-reflect on, some of the things that David Adjaye's had, gets to do and does. And it is a transactional nature. I mean, you think of his background, you think of the building he's produced, it's still clearly modern. It still comes from a modern agenda, but he's doing the best he can to reconfigure, but also present in the world, and hasn't, he's done so well, right? I think he just didn't get knighted, but I think he just got rebut, and he's doing very, very well as a kind of representing the, and everyone's saying he should get the Pritzker, which I hope he does next. I guess to ask my questions, and this comes from maybe my own naivete or my own background, recognizing my own limitations of where I've come from, where I've grown up, what I've experienced. Are you both extremely frustrated and annoyed at this point of your lives to have witnessed what I guess Nat just identified? I mean, this historic racism that exists in American culture. I mean, there's racisms and problems everywhere that keeps, almost every decade moving forward with some active presence, to try to shift the conversation. And each time it undoubtedly gets better, but undoubtedly it's still present. And as you pointed out, even with Black Lives Matter becoming a transactional brand, there's a way of working within the system that maybe isn't changing the system, or maybe it is. I don't know. I guess I have to put that out there. I mean, what's your sense of this at this point?
For me, I don't have a particular, it's not really a criticism, it's just a sort of something that I'm noting or sort of feeling about it. And I do think that for those that are in the community, they're evolving around how they want to interact and engage with it. So I don't want to pretend to understand completely exactly what it means. I'm not quite sure that we can expect these things to be pure or resolved through over time. I do hope that it is getting better, and it feels to me that it is, but I don't think it's resolved quite so clearly. We might consider that the perceptions of these things are going to change over time, no matter what. And from generation to generation, the sense of progress really has to be inherited. I do think that millennials have a different way of understanding race than, say, boomers, for example. And that's not just a simple branding exercise, but I think it's a reality. And that will not necessarily end the world or in a way that we can assume will be quote unquote better, but I do think it is evolving. I don't know, Stephen, what are your thoughts? Steve? We lost Steve.
I'm wondering if I'm the one frozen. Maybe he's frozen.
Steve, are you frozen?
I'm frozen. Yeah, I just I had issues with my Wi-Fi, so I switched networks. So I guess the question was, are you fed up, or are you? What was the term you used to the Stephen?
I don't know. I can't barely say that I can.
You don't have to. What I heard, what I heard was, are you tired? Are you fed up? I mean, and it's like, am I tired being Black? So all the conditions you talked about.
No, I wouldn't want to say that, because I think
no. I'm answering.
Way to look at it.
It seems like you talked about a fatigue of the current condition of the situation that has to do with part of being intrinsically Black growing up in this country. You mentioned it in terms of, is there a kind of fatigue to situations that we're witnessing? Either situations from the aspect of the transactional nature that David Adjaye is participating in, or situations in terms of understanding what can be considered the futility of even movements that are taking place today, like Black Lives Matter. And my answer to that is, that is the Black condition. And so I'm not tired of being Black. I mean, there's always been a kind of fatigue. And I think, and I don't want to speak for Nat, I kind of live with that fatigue, but I still have clearly hope that the practice can be changed. I still have hope that education could be changed, that the issue of decolonization or decolonialization, decarbonization, all the issues that are impacting us both as people and me as an African-American male in this culture, in this society, are fatiguing, but they are issues that I've had to deal with my entire life and my entire career. And so I'm not necessarily optimistic, but I'm hopeful that through the work that I do, the people I come in contact with, the opportunities I have to teach, to educate, and to inform, and to hopefully change the spaces that I'm operating in, that there could be something, there could be some good that's done to change the conversation and maybe change the system.
And maybe that brings me, I guess, to being in Ohio, a choice you made, right? To be in Cincinnati.
I mean, I came back because my father was dying of cancer. I lived in LA for 20 years. I taught at Woodbury and SciArc. I was happy to die in LA. I love the beach. I came back to Ohio where I'm from. Because my father had cancer. I'm an only child, and I came back to help my mother with my father's care, and then she died 2 years ago. And so it was initially during the turn down around 2010, so it was fortuitous. I was able to land a kind of full-time academic position and still help my family. And so I grew up here, and it's not LA, but I think especially when every time I pull the lever and vote here, I know I'm probably making a better contribution to the conversation than when I do that in California. And so it's where the work is, and I am interested in being where the work is. And so I think I'm making a bigger difference in changing ideas, changing hearts and minds in the context of Cincinnati than I was in Los Angeles, where I found that I was among people that were more like-minded. I get into way more arguments here.
Oh yeah?
Oh
That's
yeah.
great.
Yes, it is.
I have to say that
Yeah.
that is beautifully stated.
Thank you.
That's just Seth. He doesn't have a picture, but he's our tech guy. There's a question from Bob Ladd. You can speak.
Yes, it was about that I see too many people behind locked doors, and you seem to be showing us different ways to open up people's safe cubicles and more or less compel them to trust others, interact with their community through architecture. Now, would this be something like fitting in a stealth skateboard park or a graffiti wall that we know is going to be graffitied up?
You mean
I think there's I think that's a good suggestion. I do think there's a certain amount of so a skateboard park itself represents a challenge to what people might think is normal public space, or a wall that's meant to be graffitied up is another way of dealing with the sort of evolution or change of the city. So in the examples that when you think about a skateboard park, I think that one of the things that has always been proposed is the use of these marginal liminal spaces within the city as a way to create, activate these spaces that are now not being used. It's a skateboard park is one of those, but also the legal or the sort of liability associated with skateboard parks. And once that was resolved, you begin to see them proliferate. Or the notion of a graffiti wall in Philadelphia, the Mural Arts Project first is a real attempt to try to reinvest energy in the city by encouraging people to do less graffiti and more public art on the sort of open or exposed abandoned parts of the city. And so it's a kind of reclamation. So when I think of them, the idea that we're creating a generational or a change in what might be considered public, what might be considered private, what might be considered a positive decorum, something like a graffiti being moving into it. I think it's a nice way to think about opening up safe spaces. It does begin to be that you see this happening in places that are already contested, like the city, but I wonder if we're as clear about what this might mean when this begins to happen, or the Ferguson's question, in the suburbs, right? When you begin to see that same thing happening, are we as comfortable dealing with it there? I don't know if that helps, Steve.
I think you covered it.
But I appreciate the question. Any other questions?
Could I ask a question?
Go for it, Gabriel. Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation. You mentioned a lot the transactional nature of architecture and the built environment. And I was wondering if you think it's possible to ever get outside of that, or is everything, no matter how noble or how virtuous it's produced, will be reduced to a unit of commodity or a object of private property, no matter how well-intentioned, it can always be reduced down to that? Or can you actually get to sincerity outside of that, outside of the transactional nature?
I certainly would like to think that we can. I mean, I really can't. And there are certainly the economy and the commodification that's described is not something that has existed throughout the existence of the human being. And there are plenty of people that are operating in ways that are trying to shift the notion of what supports or makes space. I think the transactional nature of it, I was using as a mechanism to understand how, especially if we're not careful, we might find ourselves co-opted by the ease with which we can use the sort of forces of commodity and think that we're operating in a space that is pure, but in the end, we're kind of exposing a certain amount of co-option. So, the question of Rem Koolhaas doing the CCTV building as a celebrated piece of architecture, and then understanding what's currently happening in China might set up a particular sort of evolution. Now, it's not a challenge to him. If that commission came to many of us, we would probably take it, but we might be unclear about the way in which these forces can sort of expose us in ways we're not clear of. So I wouldn't want to say that it's all transactional or that that's the only way one can operate. Especially someone that's benefited from, in many ways, the sort of comforts of a generation that really has capitalized on that transactional nature.
Thanks.
Someone else with a question? Can we talk a little bit about gentrification?
Yeah.
From your two perspectives, because obviously it's a two-edged sword, right? There's some value added in gentrification for some people, and there's certain, you used I guess Stephen used the word yuppies, right? Yuppies moving into a community, which is probably our generational thought. I don't know if they use that word anymore.
They don't use that word.
What?
They don't use that wording. I mean, I
Yeah, they
know
don't use that word anymore.
I was dating myself. I think it's an interesting phenomenon in Cincinnati because when I showed that picture of old Cincinnati, there's still parts of the city that has such a density and that has so many units that are available that are in disrepair, that's being renovated, and that's still on the market, and a mix of both affordable and market rate housing. There are some parts of Cincinnati that gentrification is almost impossible just because of the density of the city at the 19th century. And so that's one of the things that Cincinnati is grappling with different from other cities. Its urban core isn't rapidly gentrifying just because of the sheer number of units that are still being occupied and still available to mixed income tenants. And so I think it's a problem with that every neighborhood has to every gentrifying neighborhood has to contend with, and it's a problem of economics, and ultimately it's a problem that that's dealt with at a kind of policy level. How new building is done, the allotments and affordances that are made for mixed income living. How gentrification is actually monitored and managed by municipalities. And so I think as an advocate for the community, I think it's our responsibility as architects and designers to be a part of that conversation. And so our sphere of influence just doesn't stop at our screens. Our sphere of influence stops at our activism as a citizen. And being in the spaces where decisions are made. And so as an architect, you can't just sort of, your job doesn't stop when you, when you when you bake the grasshopper script, or when you finish the construction drawings. It requires you to be active in politics and to be part of boards, committees, community development groups, anything that allows your voice to be heard as an agent for that community. And so I think that gentrification is a force, but so are we. And so it requires our activism to go beyond just the profession and just the discipline, and be a part of and be active in civic engagement.
Yeah, I also think that when you think about gentrification, it's nice to say that we are, so every generation has a sense. I don't think the people that did the gentrification, the story, the example might be in Soho. I think many of these were artists that were sincerely trying to find a cheap place to do their work. And from generation to generation, it turned into kind of a gentrification thing. But then the next generation might approach it a little differently. I think this happens in many different contexts. So it could be that the yuppie doesn't necessarily not exist. This is sort of like the urban hipster of the, sort of the recent, the narrative in Philadelphia was that, Philadelphia is the new Brooklyn and Brooklyn's the new Manhattan, blah, blah, blah. It's this sort of cycle of sort of, again, maybe I'm just too focused on this idea of it being just transactional. But it's nice to see that a different generation approaches it with a different vantage point given what's happened in our lifetime. So I think what public space means in a world where gay marriage is legal, what public space means in a world where we understand identity, or just, where we understand the world globally in terms of ability to network and get on a platform like this, is really kind of an interesting thing to understand what that means when we go into a space, what gentrification means from time to time.
Yeah, it's the difference between understanding what it was in Soho when the understanding of gentrification, when that term was being coined, was journalism, and what we do now is understanding it through history. And so we know these forces, we can predict these forces, we can speculate on these forces, and it's our responsibility to manage them.
Yeah,
There's another question. I don't know. They said it's anonymous attendee, so I can't bring them in. Well, they're talking about Germany had a reconciliation. Well, this gets to one of the questions I want to ask you, so this is good. Germany had its reconciliation moment by owning up to the atrocities of its past. Do you see this as a moment where the US is entering reconciliation with the history of colonialism and slavery? If so, what future would we envision? And then I kind of want to ask you to talk a little bit about reparation on that same question. Your feelings.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's a sense that the US maybe hasn't, I mean, that's why the reason I brought up Audre Lorde was the idea, that does this only come after we've been dropped to our knees? And, do we have to really get to the point, or can we somehow begin to address this through a public discourse that doesn't mean we have to destroy what we've already created? So the specific example of Germany is a sort of prescient question. If we toggle back and forth, have we really addressed it well enough? Or can we just keep it in this kind of comfortable space of mitigating it just good enough to really never solve the problem? I don't know that we'll deal with that. I understand the practice of reparations. I do think it's a complicated process. Its implementation is probably less critical to me than that the society as a whole. So I would be less interested in getting a check myself than, and I don't know if we could get to this, but more of a sense of the society being a little bit more in an endowed way, not in a way that it has to do with one check to one particular generation, but addressing this tendency of the society to ignore a certain sector of its community and the legacies associated with it. You could say something similar about the way in which we're dealing with race, but it might also be something similar but different in the way which we deal with all sorts of inequities in our society. I do think there needs to be a reaction, but I don't know that it would be better for the society if, a tenured faculty member running a university in Australia gets a check. So I'm less interested in that than I am in what it's really trying to address. The multi-generational poverty within the African American community is probably more of a dynamic concern than any one particular person getting a reparations, and that would be just a thought I have. I don't know, Steve, if you have any.
Yeah, I think I would sort of cite what's happening. I mean, this is the 100th anniversary of Greenwood, the Tulsa Race Massacre. And there was legislation brought in both Tulsa and in Congress to address it somehow, to at least talk about the issue of reparations. The few surviving victims of it, who are in their hundreds now, even the conversation of actually thinking how they can be compensated for the material loss of 100 years ago, specific to those few people that are surviving, is a non-starter. And so I think that reparations is the issue, and the conversation of reparations is larger than a monetary payout. To reduce it to a check is to not understand the breadth of just acknowledging the injustice that's happened over the centuries. It needs to start there. And the conversation is too uncomfortable for some quarters of this culture to even initiate. And so I don't think that it's anything that'll happen anytime soon. And I don't think that just because there's a Democratic administration, I like the idea that at least for the conversation is more fluid, where these conversations were not even uttered, even in the Clinton administration, and not as much in the Obama administration. So I'm interested in the cycle of change, and understanding the place for reparations, what it really means in terms of understanding injustice historically, understanding that injustice didn't stop just at slavery, didn't stop just in 1919, which is the bloodiest year of massacring, of the destruction of property and Black lives in this country, didn't stop at Tulsa, didn't stop at the destruction of, say, Kenyon Bar, and hasn't really abetted when you think of mass incarceration and George Floyd. So I think the topic of reparations is a broad one. The conversation of injustice is a broad one, but I'm glad that we're at least able to have it because it's something that I wasn't exposed to when I was even in school.
Thank you. That was, again, extremely articulate. Ella, do you want to ask your question, or do we want to let them begin? Well, Matt gets to begin his day. Stephen, you're probably about to end your day. We can ask some more, because I'm sure there are a couple more questions if you're willing to hang in there, but
I'm fine.
Yeah, I'm good.
Ella, why don't you go for it?
Okay.
Oh, let
First of all,
Ella go first, and then, yeah.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for giving this lecture. It was really interesting. Recently, been learning a lot more about how the role that code and zoning regulations play into displacement, especially in urban cities like Los Angeles. And there are historic uses of like eminent domain in Santa Monica, displacing major Black communities. So without getting into the legal aspects of it, how can architects begin to reshape urban landscapes and alter how we plan our neighborhoods so that it can become a lot more accessible to people of color and also low-income residents?
Well, there might be some acknowledgement about the limits of what an architect can do. I mean, I think that the profession is really, really defined by its successes and maybe its practices, specifically the property line, for example. So a planner probably has more of an impact on it. So the degree to which you can stretch or challenge and get something built. But that the disciplinary specifics is probably less the point. But I do think there have been all sorts of strategic action. So for the example, which I'm maybe not, the formal language I'm not particularly interested in, but the instrumentalization is the use of form-based code by new urbanists as a way to sort of tack that. Now, I don't necessarily agree with the outcome or the cultural, let's say, baggage that is often associated with it, but they are really taking a step back. They're looking at the legal practice. And I was in Miami for 14 years, and I did watch Elizabeth Plater-Zyberg work very closely with both the political and the design community to really implement changes that she thought were really critical to redressing some of the social and formal concerns. And to some degree, she was trying to slow down the movement of capital. She was trying to deal with a sort of scalar issue within the city, but it really was taking on the instruments that are, the legacy of the instruments of codes go back to the way in which the colonial empire drew lines and quartered and monetized the built environment, the landscapes. Geography is a colonial project, right? So when we think about what that means, we have to take that apart, and that is a kind of political question. You see that happening with the way in which codes and practices or actually things that allow capital to move at certain scales all begin to have specific implementation impact on the sort of execution of some of these questions that are brought to bear. I don't want to say it's just a political question, but there's a limit to what you can do as a designer with a really, really exciting bauble.
Yeah, I would reiterate, Elizabeth Plater-Zyberg is a model because of her political activism. It requires us to be at the table and influence and be an activist or be an agent for those ideas and help influence policy. So just as she did in her sphere, understand your community, understand the politics in your community, understand the different boards and committees and community public-private partnerships that allows for these questions to be addressed, and then be an advocate for them. And so it doesn't kind of stop just again at the desk. It requires your participation. So if you want to make these changes, you have to be the agent for that change. I'm
So
smiling.
you want to ask your question?
Every time I say, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. I'm smiling because every time I think of that, I think of Michael Jackson, and it just makes me sick. I appreciate Michael Jackson, but I keep on thinking of that line, and I can't stop. So next question.
Am I missing the Michael Jackson thing? Is
It's
there
a
some obvious?
song. I don't want to go there. That's already. I've already derailed it by trying to at least explain the smile. I don't want.
Stephen, may I
Go
say
ahead.
something?
Yes, you may. This is as long as it had nothing to do with Michael Jackson.
No, Michael Jackson.
Thank you.
I just want to thank you both for your very poignant presentation. As one of the few Black architecture students in the Cal Poly program right now, like a lot of the things that you guys have covered really stand out to me and, you know, resonate pretty deeply. I appreciated your kind of approach and like bringing in youth and, you know, introducing this idea of making. And I think that's a powerful thing that we have been engaged in, you know, Cal Poly's motto being learn by doing, and just how powerful that can be on, you know, a person's sense of self and potential. And so I just want to say that I'm appreciative of your guys' approach. There's like so much that resonated with me through your presentation that I wish I could, you know, we had all day. I could just pick your guys' ear. And you know, I don't even know if I really have a question per se, but you know, it's something that as a minority, I guess I have a little bit more like radical beliefs in terms of like what we can potentially do, and maybe that's like a little bit of naivety in you know, the zest of my youth or something. You know, it's like change happens so slow, and I just can't really like accept that. You know, and so I just approach every day as if radical change is possible, and it's refreshing to kind of hear from perspectives of people that have been, you know, in the industry and the limits at which an architect can affect change, and then, you know, just potential of what we can do. So
Naivete is how I get most of the things done. Like I still believe what you believe, and I go into situations thinking that I can. If I actually knew the reality of it, the amount of sheer stupidity and confidence in rallying people to my cause wouldn't be possible. So I say, take your ignorance, take your optimism, take your naivete, and do the most that you can possibly do. And then the world will be a guide for pushback. Never limit yourself. Imagine that you can do it. And hopefully in some cases that's enough. And if you can find people around you that carry the same dream, then you have a team, a dream team, if you will. And things can get done. I mean, it sounds stupid, but I have naively walked into situations with hope and optimism, and then left the situation with people saying, how did you do that? And I didn't know that there was something that I should have actually either not said or been on the lookout for. And I think that a bunch of hope and a lot of stupidity can get a lot done if you kind of work through, if you're willing to work through it. So I'm a fan of naively walking into situations and thinking everything is possible, because in some cases that's all you need. It's better than walking into the situations.
I'm struck by the notion of making being a very critical response. You know, there's a, you know, I don't know if it's the reason I went on this tear looking at material culture and the anthropology was trying to understand the way in which we credit different interactions from different cultures in the built environment. And I know that if you, so like one of the conversation is who controls architecture and what is architecture? One idea is that architecture is the documentation, the representation, the set of ideas, and that really wraps it around the epistemology of the way in which conventional ways of documenting and understanding the world are written. So like if you then think that architecture somehow is more of an engaging thing that begins to talk more about experience and less about drawings that are, or text that is handed down from generation to generation, maybe begins to break outside a sort of formal making or traditional structure. So this is what I always thought about when I was studying, and the way in which architectural theory was really pushed deep into the architectural curriculum in the middle of the last century by a rather small group of folks that graduated from certain schools and studied under certain people and created a legacy. That created a theoretical tower that then tries to assert the way in which other people bring it in, but bring in their relationship to architectural theory. So, I mean, that was I was thinking of when I saw that picture of Philip Johnson with the crowd around him. There's a lot of capitulation to history there that then asserts authority over every major school of architecture and then has an enormous impact on myself, the faculties, and then the students. And I don't know that that's the only way to think about it. So, I mean, I wonder what architecture would look like and I've said this, and Mabel and I have had this little debate about it, but I don't think that if architectural history wasn't at the core of the way in which we understand it, if it was something more like archaeology or anthropology, which have a different way of looking at history or of the past and bring it into, they're much more reflective and maybe a little less culturally dogmatic, and a little bit more, I would say, diverse in the way in which they bring it in. But our architectural tradition is really deep-seated in architectural history and art history, both of which are a little less disciplined around objectivity, the way sort of broader history. I don't think that architectural theorists have been as reframed as maybe the disciplines of anthropology. So maybe that discipline needs to be brought to its needs. But this has been an ongoing project in architectural education, where how do we sort of go away from the Western canon of architectural, which is really easy to understand, and how do we bring in other voices that might have a different tradition of making, marking, and building the world. I don't know if that was helpful. All right.
Should we end it there for the evening and say thank you and be
Thank
very
you.
grateful and appreciative of your time?
Thank you guys.
And Stephen, Matt, thank you for coming out.
Thanks for inviting us. It's great to exercise. All the best, everybody.
Wish it was live. Go and get a dinner and a drink. Anyway, take care and enjoy the rest of your day.
Next year.
All right.
Definitely.
All right. Bye.
Ciao.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.